recording. Ken, I'm going to light the chalice and do a very short reading, and then I'm going to put you in the spotlight. Actually, maybe I'll spotlight you while I'm thinking about it. Okay. Ken is spotlighted. This is from this book that I love about, I keep wanting to say old people. It's not about old people. It's about sages, those of us who have gained wisdom as we've gotten older. And this one is called We Are a River. Our life has not been an ascent up one side of a mountain and down another. We did not reach a peak only to decline and die. We have been as drops of water, born in the ocean and sprinkled on the earth. In a gentle rain, we became a spring, then a stream, and finally a river flowing deeper and stronger, nourishing all it touches as it nears its home once again. Don't accept the modern myths of aging. You are not declining. You are not fading away into uselessness. You are a sage, a river at its deepest and most nourishing. Sit by a riverbank sometime and watch attentively as the river tells you of your life. And Ken, I invite you to unmute yourself. And how did we get you unspotlighted? I'm going to spotlight you again. Oh no, you still are spotlighted, but if you don't see Ken as the big person on the screen, you can go to speaker view or pin him. Okay.
Okay.
All yours, Ken.
Well, when Libby contacted me about doing this, I told her I was neither elder nor interesting, so I was one of the young guys on the Byfriars. But she said that as far as Sherry's concerned, anybody who's older than her, older than Sherry, is an elder. So I guess there are a lot of elders in the church. I just started. I'm not exactly a native, but pretty close. I wasn't born in Rochester, but both my parents were. And I happened to be born in Brookline, Massachusetts, as an accident of World War II, because my father was stationed in Boston during World War II. But all my earliest memories are of growing up in a big old house in Chi-Lai, New York. Because of my father being an officer in the Quartermaster Corps, he was assigned after the war was over to a project of declaring war surplus and selling off warehouses full of stuff to get the government out of. They had all of the warehouses in New England filled with war stuff, and they had to get it out of there so that they could start getting production back in that part of the country. So he didn't get out of the Army from demobilization until pretty late. When he got home to Rochester, there wasn't any place that he could rent or buy. My mother and father ended up having to live with my grandmother for a short time. And finally they were, going further and further out looking for a place. And he found an old farmhouse for sale in Chi-Lai that still had an acre and a third of land underneath it. And in 1947, they bought it just to have a place to live. And at that time, Chi-Lai was filled with more cows and sheep than people. It was pretty empty. And the only people were in this little neighborhood. And it was an old German farm community that had settled there in about 1840. But there were lots of kids. So by, even from like 4 years on, I can remember just running around the neighborhood with all these kids. And I had a tricycle, so as far as I could get on a tricycle, I just went. And with my friends, and I only had to come home to eat meals and to sleep, because there was no TV, and as before I went to school, so I had lots of freedom. The first major shock came along when my brother was born. He was 4 years younger than me, and the next fall after that, I started kindergarten. It wasn't a bad deal. Kindergarten was okay. I did find out that at that time that I was one of only 3 kids in the entire neighborhood who went to the public school. Everybody in the whole neighborhood went to Holy Ghost Catholic church school. But even though my mother was Catholic, and she dragged me and then later my brother to church every Sunday, my father was way too frugal or cheap to pay twice to send kids to school, so he wouldn't send us to the Catholic school. As a matter of fact, he was not Catholic, he was agnostic, and his Sunday ritual was to read the New York Times when we went to church. That was not to my particular liking, especially in the winter. I figured I liked his church a lot better than my mother's. And eventually they said, well, I was about 4 or 5 at the time, and they said, well, when you get to be 18, you can make your own choice. And I said, okay. And I kept track of time after that. So I went to school and this, hung out with my tribe around the neighborhood, and we played games, baseball in the summer and football in the fall, and played hockey in the winter. And we mostly built forts in the woods and just ran around. Like I said, there were mostly farm fields and woods. There was not very many people out there. At that time, they had to bus everybody because it was so rural. So everybody got on the bus every morning together, and we went to the public school, and everybody stayed in the gym in the public school while the bus went out and made multiple runs. And eventually the gym filled up with kids. And then all the kids from the Catholic school got on the bus and left and went to their school, and we went to our regular class. We didn't have TV until I was in the 5th grade. So the only thing to do before going to bed was either listen to the radio or read. And my father loved opera and the New York Yankees, and I hated both. So that only left reading as something to do. And my mother wouldn't allow me to have comic books. So we had to go to the library, and I had to read library books. And I kept, telling them, my friends kept telling me that they had these TVs and we needed to get one. And my mother said, well, it's better for you to read books. Schooling, well, 1st grade was my worst year in school. I had this teacher who must have been at least 100 years old. And she walked around the room with a pointer, and anytime anybody misbehaved, she smacked them on the knuckles. About the 3rd time she hit me on the knuckles, I picked up my desk and I threw it at her. So from then on, I had regular private conversations with the principal from time to time. And I had my first meeting with a school psychologist. And he told my parents that he thought I had impulse control problems. But I don't ever remember getting hit on the knuckles again after that by her or anybody else. And I realized I had solidified my playground creds so much as being the crazy kid that I never got messed around with. In elementary school, I did get into a few scuffles on the playground, but I also had the reputation of the one who would, if you got into a fight with him, he'll try to bite a finger off or bite your ear off. And so after a while, even the bigger kids didn't want to mess. Part of, I think, my problem in school, I didn't like anything except math. And I particularly hated spelling and writing. Never was good at either one of those. And so, but I never really worried about, other kids would be saying, really worried about getting promoted. And I never really worried about it because I was the tallest kid in the class. And I figured if they didn't promote me, I wouldn't fit into the desk the next year in the lower grade. So, they couldn't do anything about it. So I cruised along this way through 5th grade, and then I got to 6th grade, and the school did a funny thing. By the time when we first started out, we were all in one classroom. But by the time we were in like 3rd or grade, they split us up into 2 classrooms, about 20 apiece. So in 6th grade, instead of the 20-20 split, they did a 28-12 split. And I ended up in the group of 12. And it was all of the people who had regular conversations with the principal that were in the group of 12. And they gave us a teacher who was a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne Division. And he started every morning with calisthenics. And under his leadership, I was compelled to change my attitude. And I actually gave up my one-on-one time with the principal. In 7th grade, the elementary school I went to had been K through 8, but by the time I got to 7th grade, it had become part of Gates Chili School District. And so in 7th grade, we shipped off to inaugurate the first year at Gates Chili Junior Senior High School as charter students. And so I spent 6 years in elementary school, and then I was going to spend the next 6 years at Gates Chili. And jumping into a building, from a building that had maybe 150 or 200 people in K through 8, because our class was the biggest. Most of the classes ahead of us in elementary school only had, maybe 15 kids in them. And all of a sudden we were at this school that was 7th through 10th grade and had over 1,000 students. So it was a bit of a shock. But I did end up meeting, I didn't know at the time, but I met Roberta, my future wife, that first day in 7th grade. In a lot of ways, this school was a lot worse than elementary school. I had a whole bunch of classes. I didn't like any of them except math and science, and gym was pretty good. Also, for some reason, they thought you needed 2 reading classes. The one they called English, the other one they called language arts. I didn't know what the difference was, but I didn't like either one of them. And in addition to that, there were always fights going on. And, the hallways were just very dangerous places. But somehow, my reputation from elementary school had been sent on to the high school. And I never got into a fight the entire time I was in junior or senior high school. Another early and recurring theme in my life was emergency department trips to St. Mary's Hospital, either for stitches or x-rays. The first time was about when I was 5. I went to the circus, and after I came back, I tried to walk across my mother's clothesline. That didn't go too well, and ended up with a bunch of stitches in the back of my head. So over the years, multiple stitches, ankle injuries from playing sports. Finally, the biggie was when I was in 7th grade. I was sledding and I lost control and I hit a tree and dislocated my back. So out of that, I managed to miss 3 weeks of school and spend some time in traction before I regained any feeling in my legs and I could walk again. Well, I regained the feeling first. It hurt like hell, and I couldn't walk because it hurt so bad. But then eventually, the pain got less and I could walk. So fortunately, as I got older, the frequency of these little episodes decreased. Also, from 3rd grade on, I spent all the summers and 1 or 2 nights a week during the rest of the year at the Arnett YMCA. At the beginning, it was for swim lessons and summer camp. And later I added doing some gymnastics and basketball. I really enjoyed that. But much later, my mother told me she took us to the Y because she thought our old gang in Chile was going to eventually get into trouble. And mostly by living in Chile, we were really isolated from real people. I didn't figure out right away that what she meant by real people was people of color, because she was an accidental suburbanite because of having to find some place to live in 1947 and not a product of, white flight. When I got to high school, I pretty much majored in football. And all of a sudden, with very little work, I started to get very good grades. And of course, at the time, I didn't realize it was mainly because of the competition I was in. My world really erupted about a few weeks to a month into the 11th grade, when my American history teacher called my parents and arranged a meeting with her and the guidance counselor at high school. This guidance counselor wasn't the one I'd had the first 4 years, or the first 4 years I was there. So she was pretty clueless. But my teacher said she was totally convinced I was grossly misprogrammed and needed to immediately have my classes changed. So they negotiated a little bit. I was already in Regents math and chemistry classes. And they decided that it was not possible to change those at that late in the start of the year. But I did have my American history and English classes swapped, so that I ended up in a accelerated college prep cohort. And all of a sudden, I was in a class with all the nerds. I had lots of homework, and I was struggling just to keep up, not just cruising along. Also, I was with a bunch of people who were real actively trying to figure out where they were going to go to college. I never even thought of that before. The only real good part about this was the first time I was in classes with Roberta and not just homeroom, because homeroom was done alphabetically, so I was always in homeroom with her. But 11th and 12th grade ended up being in most classes also. But at the end of that year, I ended up either tying or getting the highest grade in the class in American history, math 11, and chemistry Regents exams. So I really accelerated, but not English. After spending a year with the teacher telling me I didn't belong and was going to definitely fail the English Regents test, I thought, he was probably right. And I had to devise a strategy to get around his predictions. So my spelling was so bad, he told me that it didn't matter what I did, I'd fail because 50% of the test was 2 essays you had to write. And if I misspelled 10 words in those 2 essays, I'd get 0 for those essays. So I devised a strategy, and I figured out a way that if I got a minimum of 45 out of 50 on the objective portion of the test, and I planned on doing that because I got the past 10 years, you can always do this on Regents. You can look at all the Regents from history. And so I prepared study guides where I found repeated questions and just memorized the answers to them. And I figured that would get me like 45 out of 50. And I just had to pick up another 20 on the 50% that was the essays. And to do that, I couldn't misspell anything. So my strategy was to use nothing but 3, 4, and 5-letter words. Absolutely nothing bigger than a 5-letter word. And so if I had to get my message across, sacrificing style and everything else, just to have short sentences that were grammatical and had no misspelled words. Well, I got a 70. I was just happy as could be, and got together after we got our grades, and a bunch of my classmates were just devastated that they got a lot better grades than I did, but they didn't get high enough from what they expected. And so they all ended up spending the summer of our junior year, between junior and senior year, in summer school so that they could retake the English Regents and get higher scores. Well, I graduated from high school, and speed up here, I started at General Motors Institute 10 days after I graduated from high school, because that was a 5-year engineering co-op program where you went to school year round, except for 2 weeks off at Christmas and 2 weeks in summer. And you went 2 quarters a year at the academic campus in Flint, Michigan, and 2 quarters years at a GM plant somewhere. And I started out at the Delco plant on Lyle Avenue for my first 2 years. And at the end of my sophomore year, I was transferred to the Delco large motor plant in Dayton, Ohio. And that's where I came to believe that random chance plays a really major role in our lives. Think back, the paratrooper in 6th grade, the American history teacher in 11th grade, and then between my junior and senior, my sophomore and junior year of college, I got a plant assignment change to go to Dayton, Ohio. So while I was working on a co-op assignment my junior year in Dayton, the assignment is one which I would have had much earlier if I had started at Dayton. But I was assigned to work on testing a research project on the drive motor for the first GM electric test vehicle, which was called the Electrovair. Because that random connection during the winter of my junior year, I was assigned to the research and development group at Delco for the remainder of my co-op assignments. And I ended up qualifying for GMI's Bachelor's Master program, which is a program that existed where instead of that you took extra courses your junior and senior year, and that way you were sent away for your 5th year to work on a master's degree. And I went to Purdue University to work in graduate school instead of doing an ordinary 5th year. So that set of random events ended up putting me on a track of working on electric vehicles and advanced renewable energy research for the rest of my professional career. After college, I worked on electric drives at Delco and Dayton for a while, for a few years. And then I moved to the GM Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. And for a total of 11 years after college, I worked on electric drives. That phase of my career ended with the election of Ronald Reagan. Energy efficiency and electric drives were out, and gas guzzlers were back in. I didn't particularly like what GM had planned for me, so I took a leave of absence and I went to work as a research assistant at the University of Wisconsin. It was an educational leave, so I was there to work on my PhD for the next 3 years. When I finished my PhD, I really didn't want to go back to General Motors because of the drastic changes that Roger Smith had made in the 3 years I was gone. And the usual research positions for people in the energy department were all not hiring at that point, because what was hiring was work on nuclear weapons and Reagan's big Star Wars programs. If you remember those, they were really big about the time I got my PhD, and there was all kinds of openings, but I didn't want to work on weapons research. So I looked around and looked at all the alternatives, and I decided to take a job as assistant professor in electrical engineering at the University of South Florida, thinking at the time that it was just going to be like a temporary holding position till something better came along. And then 30 years later, I ended up retiring. And during that time, I worked on a whole bunch of different energy-related projects with students and other faculty in funded research. And I look back now and I said, well, you know, when I was a kid and I finally got a television set, which, you know, we were the last people, I think, in Monroe County who actually got a television set. My parents were not real fond of it. But then I did find out that there were 2 guys that I was in the nerd class with in high school who never had a television. So I guess I wasn't that deprived. My dream job would have been to be the scientist on Captain Midnight and the Secret Squadron. And I figured as a research engineer, I actually did come pretty close. As far as religion is concerned, I had started having trouble buying into the Catholicism business when I was about 12 years old, and they changed the Mass from Latin to English. When it was Latin, I could just sort of zone out. But once it was in English, and I didn't have to read the subtitles anymore, it got difficult. My first wife was Catholic and insisted that we do that with our daughter, but I, like my father, was way too cheap to ever pay twice to send her to a Catholic school. And just like my brother and I, she went to public schools. But I think not going to Catholic school and having a father who always made us look up answers. He would never, you'd say, how do you spell this? There's a dictionary over there, figure it out yourself. or, what, how do you do something? Well, we also had an encyclopedia. So it was always, the answer was always the same. He would never tell you straight out. So I think it was, that made me less susceptible to brainwashing. My initial doubts had to do with discovering real inconsistencies. That's about like discovering systemic racism. It's sort of the rot that's inside. Then in high school, when I had to go to religious education classes, and back then they actually, had some deal where you had to, they let you out of regular school one day a week to go walk to the church and, take your religious ed classes, and then you had to walk back to the high school. So it sort of stigmatized you. And they were starting to talk in those classes about theology and dogma, and I only kept discovering more problems. So to summarize and not use too much time, I reunited with Roberta at our 40th high school reunion, and we eventually got married and lived September through April in Tampa, Florida, and May through August in Rochester for 7 years until I retired. And she'd been grown up as Presbyterian and had been an Episcopalian for a while. And she wanted to try something we could do together. So in Tampa, we started exploring churches. And we first tried a Methodist church and then an Episcopal church. And they're both funny stories, but not enough time here. That's a different story. But neither of us was particularly happy with either of those churches. And a Rotarian friend of ours who was a lawyer and had done some real estate work for the Tampa Unitarian Church suggested we give it a try. We did, and we were hooked. And so after we retired and relocated back to Rochester full time, we became members at the Rochester First Unitarian Church. Okay. I hope I didn't go too long. So what do we do now, Libby?
I have to unmute myself. But you actually have plenty of time, and I would love to hear about those stories when you tried the other churches in Tampa.
Oh, well.
It's all about Rotary, too.
Well, yeah, I can tell you about the other churches and about Rotary, because Tampa's in the South, so it's very evangelical. And so even the Episcopal Church, which, most Episcopal churches are sort of like Catholic churches, but even the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church in Florida are very Bible-beating, evangelical places. And the other funny thing about the Episcopal Church was that they've got the same, even though their priests can be married, they've got the same problem recruiting priests that the Catholic Church does. And so a lot of the Episcopal priests are Africans. Now, there's no, I didn't have a problem with having this guy as the priest, but, he was from Nigeria, and real nice guy, but I couldn't understand a word he said. I mean, he sounded like he had a mouthful of mashed potatoes all the time. And, I'm sure he was saying something important, but I couldn't figure out what he was saying. So that was sort of our turn off with the Episcopal church we went to. And the Methodist church was just very much, everybody except Methodists were going to go to hell. And, there's not, there's a lot, it's just too difficult to buy. And as far as the Rotary, that's a funny story too, because it was loaded with evangelicals. And we actually had a retired minister, and he's the one person that was never asked to give the invocation. There was about 4 people who rotated doing the invocations, and they were all very evangelical. And the one guy we got a real kick out of because he was always saying a prayer for the stock market. He wanted the market to go up, and he was a financial advisor. And Roberta was a financial advisor too, and she thought it was real hoot that this guy would do the invocation and ask God's blessing on the market for the day. That was our. That's what led us to go to the Unitarian Church, which is the Unitarian Church is right down the street from the University of South Florida. Maybe a mile or two, and but it's Unitarian churches in the South are very small and usually very hidden because during the Jim Crow era, they used to get the crosses burned on their lawns and stuff like that. So our church in Tampa was in the woods, and you had to know where it was to get into it. And it was all locked up, and they only opened it up on Sunday for service. Or, there was next to it was a building for meetings, office building and meeting rooms. And that's where all the nighttime activity happened. But the actual church was a very unique structure. It was a dome.
So I'm just switching my view to gallery view so I can see people. If you would like to ask Ken a question, Jack and Sandy have their hand up. They know how to do this. Go ahead, Jack and Sandy.
We're unmuted, I take it.
Yeah.
I don't see.
Yes.
Okay. Ken, I really enjoyed the way you came from a kid who went to the principal's office a lot to getting a PhD. So I would like to know how your parents responded to this change in your thinking about education and getting along okay.
Well, they actually were very happy, and I never went to the principal's office after 5th grade. So the other thing that happened in 5th grade was they discovered that I was extremely nearsighted, and I think part of the problem was that for a long time I never could see what was on the board, but because I was the tallest kid in the class, I was always in the back row. And I really didn't know what the teacher was doing most of the time, and until they started testing your eyes for some reason, doing eye tests in school, and they called up my parents and said, you got to get this kid in to get him tested by a ophthalmologist or optometrist or ophthalmologist, whichever one it is. And so I ended up getting tested. I was really nearsighted. And so I started wearing glasses about halfway through 5th grade. And I think that made a real major difference.
I can imagine. Yeah. Who else has questions? Barb DeLeo and Deborah both. So
Thank you.
Barb, I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
Okay, it's all right. I always struggle with the mute and then the video goes off and then I have to, maybe in another year I'll be able to work this thing. Ken, your story was compelling, absolutely compelling. And as I listened to you talk, because I'm a teacher, was a teacher, I was thinking of how things were so different. You're younger than me enough to know that during those early days, people didn't know about, attention or learning disabilities. And the first thing I thought when you were talking about getting in trouble, I thought he was just so smart in this class. He was probably bored, right? So I'm glad that you had a fabulous high school American history teacher who recognized your talent and that you got your eyes examined. I also was found to have to wear glasses in first grade because I was tested in where you lined up in the hall and went into the nurse's office and read the chart, right? And I also did not realize that the world didn't look fuzzy like an impressionist painting. It was like Dadaism or something. And when I realized the world was crisp, the world opened up. I want you to talk a little bit, if you will, about your experience with the roof and working with Barrow and so on and so forth. And
Oh, the roof at church.
Ken agreed to be our sort of
I was
person of experience on the roof committee, and he was invaluable, I have to say.
well, that was because I was, from Byfriars, and I was a professional engineer for all those years. And the other thing was I wasn't afraid to climb a ladder. So, the one thing about the liaison to the, which Joel hated, and he was real happy to turn over to me, was that, to go up and see what was going on and keep on top of it, because you had to climb up the outside of the building on a ladder. And, from my days of climbing trees when I was a kid, heights never bothered me. And so climbing up the ladder was okay. And, we had a long running leak problem on the roof. And it was pretty much the only solution was to tear it all off and take it back to the way it was built in 1960 and start over. And it was a major cost, big cost. And it was a real major project. It took a long time, several months. And, we had to just beat on each individual little problem. I mean, the leak in the choir room and, all these things. We finally, the contractor and the architect and I was amazed. The architect is a lady, and she's, yeah, and she's same age as we are, and she walked up the outside ladder too. So I mean, it was a real experience, but it was a pleasurable experience. And we finally got the flashing done, and with a little bit of setbacks, we finally got it done. And I think we had weekly meetings between Joel and the architect and the contractor and myself during the whole project to keep on top of it, make sure we're staying up. And I did learn a lot about roofs, and the roofing materials, and actually the material that had been on there, the urethane roof, was an excellent design for a warehouse. But in a warehouse situation, you can go over the edges and have a seal. Well, because of architectural constraints, you had to come up to the edge on our roof, and with the temperature changes, it caused the urethane to develop big cracks and leaks. And so it was a never-ending job of trying to patch the leaks. Needed to go back to the layered, old-fashioned type of roof. The best roof for a church is a lead roof, like the one that was on the cathedral in Notre Dame. Of course, it ended up, being a real disaster when it burned. But that roof had been on there for hundreds of years and it didn't leak. So, and the architect told us going into the thing that the absolute best roof for a church is a lead roof. Unfortunately, you've got to bring, if you're going to do a lead roof, you've got to bring a crew in from Germany to do it, because there are no people in the United States who will do lead roofs because of the OSHA and the health concerns. That the only people who still do lead roofs are Germans, and that would have been way out of our budget. So we went with the next best thing.
And I can't tell you how grateful we are. I mentioned this last week, I think, but when I started at the church in 1984, there was a wading pool in the center of the sanctuary because it was leaking. And I still decided this was my church, but it was that, and Bob talked about that roof so much that I knew way more than I ever wanted to know.
Yeah,
I'm really glad that you did this, Ken. Thank you.
Bob was the guy who taught me what the problems were. And
Yeah.
I just sorry it wasn't around when it was finished.
He took me up inside on the second floor. There's a little storeroom, and you could get up to the roof from somewhere, and I don't remember. Anyway, never mind.
There's a closet on the second floor.
Yeah,
yeah. It goes up to the roof.
Really?
So we might have time for one last question. Deborah, you had your hand up and then you went away. Does anybody else have?
I'm glad to ask, Libby.
Okay.
So Ken, just fabulous story. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if and when you ever discovered that you really liked or loved reading, and what helped you make that decision.
Well, what I knew that I really liked science and math way early, elementary school age, and that as I got through high school, I knew I was either going to go to, become a physicist or an engineer. So that I didn't have any of this thing of, people go to college and I don't know what I'm going to do. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was, become an electrical engineer.
And did you ever develop a love for non-technical reading?
I like to read. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do. And now I alternate between novels and nonfiction. For an awful long time, I didn't read anything but novels. When I was not, because I had to read so many technical articles and journals at work all the time that I sort of stayed away from nonfiction and just read novels. But now, I alternate because I'm in the nonfiction book club, but then you gotta read something to take your mind off, because every nonfiction book you ever read is really, they get nonfiction books because they point out all the horrible stuff. I mean, I don't think I've ever read a nonfiction book that was happy. I think the definition of nonfiction is unhappy stuff.
That's another whole hour of discussion. We could talk about that. But before we leave, could you just get Roberta to come poke her head in and say hi to us? Because I can hear her in the background, and we just need to say hi, Roberta.
She was using my cell phone.
Oh, okay.
It was the second person on that because she didn't want to.
Hi, Roberta.
I was keeping an eye on him because his mother Ruth was a smacker. Whenever he misbehaved, she'd just smack him. And when we got back together again, she took me aside one time and she said, whenever he gets out of line, just smack him. And it works. All I have to do is remind him, your mother said.
Good to see you both. In the chat, Barb DeLeo reminds us that elders and allies will be at Hudson and Titus Avenue at the intersection from 12 to 1. I'm planning to go today, Barb. I have my mask and my little handmade sign. Next week, we'll talk about our favorite memories of church. And the week after that, Jean Weaver is going to grace us with her story on the first day of spring. So I'm glad you figured out how to get on today. I'm not sure what the problem was, and I apologize, but we will try to smooth it out for next time. So much love to all of you. Happy weekend, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Ken.
Next week
It
is
was
daylight
great to
saving
have you
time.
here.
Daylight saving time. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, it's Sunday.
You told us he was interested.